The following sermon is on Isaiah chapters 3 and 4. It'd be great if you could read them before listening to this sermon. It's traditional to sympathise with the underdog. However, I've always been someone who feels for those who spend most of their life at the top. Such people only know of success, and they've never learnt to fail. And though the underdog has learnt how to deal with failure, when those at the top fail, they just don't know what to do. For example, Manchester United. They were always once at the top of the Premiership. But as soon as they began losing, they frantically went about trying new managers and buying new players, trying everything to regain the glory that they'd lost. Or Donald Trump, as though he's only ever known success, climbing the ladders of business until he eventually reached the top of the American ladder in 2017. But as soon as he realised he'd failed in the 2020 election, he began filing lawsuits, unable to face the reality that he'd failed. Or the cyclist Lance Armstrong. He spent many years basking in victory, winning the Tour de France 7 times in a row. Since that, evidence of drug taking has come to light, and he's been stripped of his titles. And yet, unable to handle the shame, Lance Armstrong spent years in denial, unable to handle the truth about himself. Well, it's not just the Man Uniteds and Lance Armstrongs of this world that need a philosophy of failure. We all need to learn how to deal with failure as well. For not only will we fail to meet our own standards, the Bible speaks of us all falling short of the glory of God. In Romans 3 we read that there is no one righteous, not even one. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We sin, and none of us can deny it, though most of the time we do. Some do a Man United, always trying hard to prove they are better than they are. Some do a Donald Trump, quick to defend their own innocence, whilst equally quick to point out that everybody else is corrupt. Some do a Lance Armstrong, always in denial, trying to hide their sin through excuses and lies. If I'm honest, I do a bit of all three. You, me, everybody needs a philosophy of failure. That is a biblical way of facing our sinfulness face on. So, a philosophy of failure. Well, the southern part of Israel, Judah, had spent years denying their sinfulness. They paid people called prophets to say nice things about them. They did religious stuff in the hope that this would pacify God. They put their fingers in their ears whenever God spoke to them about their need to repent. They closed their eyes when God called them to take a hard, long look at themselves. Maybe you can see the same traits in yourself. Southern Israel was a people in denial. That was until God acted and they could deny their sin no more. In chapter 3, we hear of God taking away Israel's food supply, water supply. God taking away the Israel's supply of people, as well as their supply of luxury items that the women wore. God would literally strip off the nation of everything. And why? Because only when God took away everything would Israel finally realize they needed something else taking away. Chapter 4 verse 1. In that day 7 women will take hold of one man and say, "We will eat our own food and take our way and provide our own clothes." Only let us be called by your name. Take away our disgrace. When Israel was brought to their knees, their denial would end, and they'd be forced to face their own sinfulness face on. And at that moment, they'd be begging to have their disgrace taken away. Take away our guilt. Take away our shame. Take away our record of having failed. But despite, in chapter 4, God offering to do exactly that for Israel, Israel instead looked to man-made solutions instead. Verse 1 of chapter 4 shows us this in picture language. 7 women all looking to one man to marry them. 7 women all looking to one man to marry them, despite their lack of bracelets and jewelry. This is a picture of people's unceasing desire to find people who say they look beautiful, even though they might be dressed in rags and not have washed for an entire year. This is a picture of how we try to cover our disgrace through the man-made solutions of denial, excuses, and a false belief in our own virtue. Saying to ourselves, I am a good person. Option A, we can live in denial and be judged. Or option B, we can face our failures and learn that we are loved. God speaks in verse 4 of how he would show his love to Israel. The Lord will wash away the filth of the woman of Zion. He will cleanse the bloodstains from Jerusalem. Guilt. A bad feeling about the bad things that we do. Guilt is like a stain. We pick it up when we sin, and we carry it around with us for the rest of our life. That's why the revealing of a sin committed 10 years ago can still make us feel guilty. Even a 20-year-old crime can be prosecuted in a court of law. We've all got a record of 20, 30, 40 plus years of sin. And the only way to deal with this record is to have God burn that record altogether. Verse 4. The Lord will wash away the filth of the woman of Zion. He will cleanse the bloodstains from Jerusalem. And how? By a spirit of judgment and a spirit of fire. Like fire that burns paper to a crisp, God was offering to burn up Israel's entire record of sin and failure. And what God would do for Israel, God is willing to do for you. All your guilt, all your shame, all the stains that you and I have ever picked up, God is willing to deal with them all. You know, you can choose the philosophy of failure that denies or minimizes your sin, and you'll still carry that stain around with you for the rest of your life. But choose the biblical philosophy of failure, and you'll be able to face your sin, face yourself, and face God, knowing that you've been forgiven. Verse 2 speaks of the theology that is the biblical reason behind this philosophy. For in verse 2, God speaks of how he will deal with both Israel and our sin. Chapter 4, verse 2. In that day, the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land will be the pride and glory of the survivors in Israel. Those who are left in Zion, who remain in Jerusalem, will be called holy, all who are recorded among the living in Jerusalem. Imagine a battle ending and someone taking a census of the survivors at the end. If your name was on that sentence, you could boast that you'd survived through your own actions. You'd done something to survive. But imagine surviving that same battle and the opposing general coming to you with another bit of paper. This bit of paper contains a list of people he'd been told his soldiers were not to kill. How would you react if you read your name on this bit of paper? You couldn't boast that you'd saved yourself. You'd survived because of the choice of another. The opposing general's actions caused you to be spared. In verses 2 and 3, God speaks of such a bit of paper, a record of all the Israelites he'd chosen beforehand to survive the Babylonian invasion. In other words, these people had been saved from God's judgment. These people had been saved by God's judgment, by God's choice. God's grace had caused them to be spared. Verses 2 and 3 had much relevance for the people of the time, and they have relevance for all of mankind as well. For the way God makes people right with himself is exactly the same. The way God makes people right with himself has nothing to do with our actions. It has nothing to do with our choice. Confessing your sins to a judge could equally result in condemnation or salvation. Only if the judge shows grace would you survive. The good news is God has chosen to offer you grace. For through the actions of his Son, Jesus, the record of all of your sin can be burned. Verse 2. In that day the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land will be the pride and glory of the survivors in Israel. Beyond Israel's own day, God promised he would raise up somebody nicknamed the branch. This was a nickname for the Messiah. And this Messiah, this branch, would be the one who would make anyone who trusts in him, holy. That is, holy and fully right with God. This branch, or Messiah, was God's own Son, Jesus Christ. God has placed the penalty of our sin on his Son Jesus, and God has sent his fiery judgment in Jesus' direction, not yours. As God would go on to say in chapter 53 of Isaiah, he, speaking of Jesus, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. God placed the penalty of your sin on Jesus and sent his fiery judgment in Jesus' direction instead. And because he has fully dealt with your sin, you can face your failures face on. Being honest about your sin rather than denying it. Facing your sinfulness rather than trying to hide from the worst about yourself. Coming to God without fear, knowing that you've been truly forgiven. Which philosophy of failure will you live by when you wake up tomorrow? Will you live in denial and be judged? Or will you face your failures and learn that you are loved? Loved so much that God did something about your sin, despite him knowing who you are and the cost of forgiveness. That's philosophy of failure. And secondly and lastly, a philosophy of brokenness. Verses 6 and 7 of chapter 3 could easily have been taken from the official magazine of Manchester United, a team who spent years looking for a new manager to restore the team to the Ferguson glory days of old. Trophyless Old Trafford is a heap of ruins, and every manager since has had no remedy to fix this dying cause. What has been the response to such brokenness? Well, 1. Desperation. Man United desperately seeking somebody to fix this broken team. And 2. Despair. Despair that no such individual can be found. Both desperation and despair were the response of Israel to their brokenness. Firstly, desperation to find a leader like King David, who would restore Israel to the glory days of old. Secondly, there was the response of despair. Israel was too broken for any man to fix it. And so, in Israel's time of judgment, chapter 3, verse 6, a man will seize one of his brothers in his father's house and say, "You have a cloak, you be our leader, take charge of this heap of ruins." But in that day he will cry out, "I have no remedy." Israel had denied their sin and ignored God's warning about judgment. As a result, judgment would come via the nation of Babylon, and the nation would become a heap of ruins. Israel would desperately look to a human leader to heal their brokenness, only for those who sought such a leader to find that the task of healing was too big. Despair, it would seem, was the only option left, as every leader would respond, "I have no remedy for this dying cause." Thousands of years later, the need for a solution to brokenness has not changed. And I'm not talking about Manchester United. Everywhere you go, people are desperate to find a solution to the disappointments and difficulties of life. We're all looking for a cure. We're all trying to avoid life's problems, trying to put off health problems, for example, as long as we can. We're all trying to deal with life's problems, for example, hoping some person or some piece of technology can offer us a solution. We're all trying to cope with life problems. For example, cope with the help of a pill for depression, or cope via the escapism of binge-watching TV. Now, none of these are wrong, and I use nearly every one that I've just mentioned. But there are dangers if determination or despair become our overarching philosophy. There's the danger of determination. Freud, the famous psychologist, blamed 18th century voyages of discovery for raising unrealistic expectations of heaven on earth. For when people like Captain Cook returned from voyages, they'd report on the many utopias that they discovered elsewhere. For example, Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii. Since then, Freud said, everybody has been seeking heaven on earth. Now, you might not be planning on getting in a boat and pursuing the American dream, but we've all bought into the idea that heaven on earth is possible. We all expect to have a perfect job, a perfect marriage, perfect health, and a perfectly easy next week, next month, and next year. The expectation that we can avoid difficulty causes us to complain when we realize that we can't. And the expectation that we can discover the perfect life leaves us disappointed, for heaven on earth does not exist. There's the danger of desperation, and then of course there is the danger of despair. The words, "I have no remedy," fit just as easily into 21st century mouths as they did into the mouths of Israel's leaders. Why? Well, because no doctor, No government, no therapist, no healthcare system, no form of technology, no desert island, no relationship in your life. None of these has the solution to all the things that trouble us and cause us pain. This discovery can lead you to despair if you are not careful. And this despair will lead you to either seek some form of escape, for example, alcohol, pleasure, or suicide. Or this discovery will lead you into negative thought patterns from which you cannot escape. Choose determination or despair as your philosophy of brokenness, and you're heading for ruin. But thankfully God offers us a better option in chapter 4. Chapter 4 verse 5. Then the Lord will create over all of Mount Zion, and over those who assemble there, a cloud of smoke by day, and a glow of flaming fire by night. Over everything the glory will be a canopy. It will be a shelter and shade from the heat of the day, and a refuge and hiding place from the storm and rain. My guess is that you frequently walk out of your front door hoping for a perfect day, only for wind and rain to ruin it. Verses 5 and 6 paint the opposite picture. Israel walking out of their front door, expecting to discover the same problems that ruined yesterday. But instead they discover that God has brought them to a place in which He is protecting them from all harm. For Israel, this was a picture of their return from exile in Babylon, and God dwelling in their midst again. But even their return from exile was still plagued with brokenness and trouble. Instead, these verses point further into the future, to the time of Jesus' second coming. For on the day that Jesus comes, we will walk out of our doors to discover the problems of yesterday will be no more. For those who believe in Jesus, on that day, He, God, will wipe up death forever. Chapter 25, verse 8. He, God, will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove His people's disgrace from all the earth. The Lord has spoken. In that day they will say, "Surely this is our God. We trusted in Him, and He saved us. This is the Lord. We trusted in Him. Let us rejoice and be glad in His salvation." If desperation is your philosophy of brokenness, you'll always be disappointed by the world's lack of solutions. If despair is your philosophy of brokenness, at least you're being honest. This world has been broken since Isaiah's day, and there is little sign of things changing soon. But if your philosophy of brokenness is based on the theology that is the teaching of the Bible, then it'll protect you from complaining about what you don't have, and it'll keep you from despairing about the difficulties that you do have. Why? Because God promises that one day He will fix all brokenness, and this is very good news indeed. In a vision of this future, John writes, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. There was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and He will dwell with them. They will be His people, and God Himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.'"